This is a Philip Guston painting from 1969, The Studio. It shows all the things one would associate with an artist studio: an easel, the paintbrush, the painting, the artist's palette, the brushes, the window, a curtain, traditional curtain in the artist's studio. So it's a double portrait. It's a double self-portrait. You've got the artist painting, the artist painting, the artist. So it's a painting about what happens in the studio. But it's not simply, I would say, a reduction of the elements of the studio to their simplest form, but rather it's a way of inviting us to fill the empty spaces and the uncertainties in the painting ourselves. I mean, it's both a painting of a studio, but it's also a demonstration of the studio and how the studio works. I mean, the studio is a place in which the world is invited in all its different elements and then fragmented, and these fragments are rearranged and then sent back out into the world as, in this case, a painting. So the different fragments of the studio are here. An enigmatic head, simplified hands, a rudimentary canvas with its nails. And what it does is it invites a whole set of associations to meet the painting halfway. The painting always meets us halfway. There's the world coming towards us in the painting, all the different objects in it. And onto this we project all the associations we have with the painting. Part of its crudeness, and part of, I would suspect, the reasons for its crudeness, is to keep this open-endedness of how we should respond to the different elements. And there are immediate associations for me. On the one hand, the hand with the cigarette for me immediately brings to mind the Max Beckmann self-portrait in the tuxedo with his cigarette in the hand, but also importantly the big vein that Beckmann always painted in his hand. It was like the signature of his hand, the vein in his hand. And that we get is turned into these three lines on the glove. The hand is turned also into a glove, and of course the glove is the glove of Mickey Mouse, which would have those three lines. And the glove, Mickey's three fingers and the lines on the glove, was a way of Disney saying, how does one give a hand to a mouse? How does one solve that problem? And that's obviously a question which Guston is confronting, moving from the wildness of abstract expressionism, where one didn't have to think, what does a hand look like? What does a head look like? How do we represent them? To the question of, well then, in this, if he is bringing the world back into paintings, recognizable objects, clock, easel, paintbrushes, window, curtain, how do you do a head? And his solution in these early paintings certainly was to use the image of the hood. And there are obvious American associations of the Ku Klux Klan in the hood, but there are also many other associations which relate to the hood. When I first saw it, I thought of Goya's paintings of the Inquisition. In my head, I'd seen these people as all wearing hoods. When I went to check on them, in fact, they're not wearing hoods, they're wearing dunce caps, but there's something of the conical shape that one sees again over here. And again, it's not a question of, are these accurate associations, but rather, are they associations which arise unbidden and which make part of the connection between us and the painting. But there are also other hoods. The most obvious one would be Alfred Jarry's depiction of Auberois, in which he always depicted him with a hood. This is in the 1890s in Paris. It was a satirical sketch of his school teacher, but it's certainly something that Guston would have been aware of. It doesn't mean that Guston was thinking, I need to do Jarry's head, but that somewhere in his head is all the history of images that one associates with them. I mean, Guston was very influenced, and not very influenced, but very impressed with the work of Giorgio de Chirico. And de Chirico's way of dealing, how does one draw a human head, was to turn them either into mannequin heads, or into, and a painting like this, two masks, into masks. So they're both heads and not heads. In the same way that the easel and the painting is both easel and painting, but also paint. It happily shifts between us looking at simply as this expansive, fantastic pink. We could be looking at a Tiepolo sky or a Goya piece of silk in this painting. And one of the glories of the Guston paintings are their dirty pinks that he shows us in a way more magnificently. Not unrelated, I would say, to the kind of broad expanse of color one would have found in Mark Rothko, but for me in a much more interesting way. Much more interesting because they tie us still to the world. They make an uneasy tension between us and the world, between the material of the studio, which is this dirty, thick paint that Guston uses, and the world we recognize around us. But there are other De Chirico influences, I would say. I mean, you get the clock from the Philosopher's Conquest of 1913. Again, that sits on the wall in a very simplified form. You get in other ways, which I'm sure are from De Chirico, things like the dotted line showing a sewn seam, which you get both here in the hood that the man is wearing, the artist is wearing, and also then repeated in the canvas. These fat nails we see in the De Chirico paintings, which are also paintings of studios in which one can see these different canvases and nails and the various attributes of what happens in the studio. We get also from De Chirico, I would suggest, some of the particular colors, the green that we find in De Chirico, but it's a transformation. And it's obviously, it doesn't really matter whether Guston was thinking of De Chirico specifically, but rather that these are part of the internal imagination of how to draw the world and what the world is in his paintings. And the great thing about these paintings, these paintings made in those miraculous first years when Guston left the abstract expressionist paintings, but took all the lessons from it of how to apply paint, of how to understand a painting as a record of the dance of the painter, a trace of the gestures of each brush mark as it has been put down. The astonishing thing is to take all these lessons that he had from those years of abstract painting and bring the world along with him into the studio and then back out from the studio to us.